At the end of this debate, the key, oh, no, never mind. So, the feminist movement has always been about progress, about challenging the stories, systems, and norms that clearly restrict gender equality. Today, in our team, we argue that it is time for the feminist movement to take a clear stance in opposing popular fairy tales that portray traditional gender roles. So let's just first clarify what this opposition looks like in our case. We are not asking to ban fairy tales or remove what individuals can read or enjoy. What we advocate for is a symbolic and public rejection of the continued uncritical celebration of stories like Cinderella, Snow White, or Sleeping Beauty. Tales like remain dominant despite reinforcing outdated ideas about who women are and what they should value. This means feminist leaders, educators, and creators speaking out, offering alternatives and making it clear that these stories no longer align with our values of equity, autonomy, and liberation from the gender binary. These traditional tales follow a crucial pattern. Female characters are valued for their beauty, not their ideas. Their stories are passive, often ending only when they're rescued or chose by a man. These messages are clear that femininity is about waiting, about being good and quiet, and that happiness lies in marriage. And while we do have more diverse media today, this does not erase the iconic power of these tales as classics. They are still what children see in picture books, what is performed in school plays, what floods children's clothing and these merchandises. And these stories are so normalized that even when new ones appear, they struggle to compete for attention. This leads to our first argument that these tales reinforce harmful gender norms throughout cultural prestige. From a young age, children absorb these stories as definite truth. When girls repeatedly see female characters celebrated for their appearance and rewarded with love from a boy if they're good, obedient, and passive, and they learn to mirror these ideals, boys in return learn that they are expected to take action, save, and lead. Even when more empowered stories exist, they remain optional while the classics are foundational. This creates a cycle where some damaging ideas are passed on generation after generation. Feminist opposition disturbs this cycle. By calling out the message deeply planted in these tales, the movement gives society permission to re-evaluate what we hand down to our children. Moving on to our second argument, this opposition is not just morally right, it is strategically beneficial for the feminist movement. Feminism loses strength when it sends mixed signals. If we fight sexism in the workplace but stay silent on the stories that condition girls to be passive and pretty from age 4, only age 4, we undercut our own messages. Opposition clarifies. Feminism isn't about letting everything to be a matter of individual choice in isolation. It's about recognizing how cultural shapes consent, ambition, and identity, and that means confronting the source, yes, even when it's wrapped in these massive nostalgias. So, moreover, this stands to strengths solitary within the movement and makes our message clear to the public. Teachers, parents, and young feminists now have a framework to say this story might be beloved, but it doesn't reflect who we want to be. This is not this is cultural accountability, so opposition cannot deny this. In conclusion, this is not about censorship, but it's about literally cultural leadership that will happen in our stance. The feminist movement has always led change by being bold and principled. Opposing these tales is definitely not different. It's the next step in ensuring the next generation is raised on these stories that definitely reflect who they are and who they can become rather than these tales that reflect on one stereotype. Therefore, never been prouder than this to propose.
Panel opposition believes that feminism at its core is about empowering women to make their own choices, to decide for themselves what kind of life, identity, or role system best. For some, that means breaking norms and rejecting traditional roles as government says. But for others, especially those who find meaning in being mothers, homemakers, and supportive partners, traditional gender roles can feel authentic and fulfilling. Hence, opposition will argue that the feminist movement ought to promote choice by making all narrative available for girls and women. Bashing traditional fairy tales just because they're not liberal enough only hurts women and invites backlash and regrets the achievements women have made so far. APJR. Before we move on to arguments and responses, government states that first of all, tales reinforce harmful gender norms. We agree. That's why introducing other forms of alternative fairy tales is a better way for the children to widen the scope of perspectives. Being exposed to a variety of narrative from an early age will help these kids be more open to any type of one regardless of background. This can happen without the direct opposition of boycotting of traditional fairy tales, especially when these give comfort or a sense of relief for women who are forced to take their traditional gender roles in a highly patriarchal society. The second argument on government side was about it being strategically good for combating sexism. We agree that the ideal feminist and government criticizes that the main character must be skinny Eurocentric is incorrect to be forced as a societal norm. However, if the only alternative fairy tales are forced, with main characters including only individuals from marginalized communities, some audiences may not feel relatable anymore or feel excluded themselves. Think of how the Black Little Mermaid was criticized for changing the original too much, for being considered as reverse racism for white people. Thus, pursuing all narrative for both traditional and white and alternative fairy tales creates a more inclusive environment of media where everyone can be represented equally without having to define what ideal feminism looks like or should behave like, without alienating anyone. Moving on to our third argument, which is that opposing popular fairy tales that portray traditional gender roles can unintentionally undermine and alienate a significant group of women, particularly those who, by choice or circumstance, still live within these roles. In many parts of the world, especially in deeply patriarchal societies, women are often expected or forced to embrace traditional gender roles. These include being housewives, caretakers, or being daughters and wives. In such society, opportunities for education, employment, or independence are limited in the first place, leading these women to take the traditional gender role with no other options. For many of these women, traditional fairy tales like Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty are not oppressive but relatable in some sense because it provides emotional comfort, familiarity, or even small moments of joy reflecting the kind of life they're expected to live. These stories allow them to romanticize, reclaim value in their own lived experiences, even if those experiences are shaped by inequality. If the feminist movement actively and vocally oppose these fairy tales, frame them as purely harmful, outdated, or dangerous, it sends a message, even if unintentionally, that there is something wrong or shameful about the way these women live. That if they relate or find solace in these stories, they are somehow less feminist and less liberated. Two impacts from this. First, it creates a damaging binary. Either you're independent, empowered, a modern woman, or you're outdated and oppressed. Such framing is not only exclusionary, but it also contradicts the core values of feminism itself, which are about choice, respect, and dignity for all women. Second, worse, in these patriarchal societies, feminist messaging are already under attack. If feminism is seen as attacking stories that bring comfort or cultural value, it becomes even easier for opponents to label the movement as foreign, elite, or disconnect from the realities of most women. In conclusion, by proposing fairy tales that portray traditional gender roles without nuance, the feminist movement is alienating the very women it claims to support. Moving on to our second argument, which is that opposing popular fairy tales puts the feminist movement at risk of being labeled as radical and causing backlash. Recognize, children's stories today are increasingly becoming liberal, where they showcase liberal heroines to break gender stereotypes. Hence, there's already a healthy balance of various gender narratives like this, and children today are already exposed to many liberal values. Then, when the feminist movement actively attacks fairy tales, it weakens the feminist movement's ability to build broad-based coalitions. When large numbers of women feel judged or excluded, they're less likely to support or identify with the movement. This not only reduces participation in feminist advocacy, but also fuels that the narrative that feminism is elitist or culturally alien. Especially in conservative or patriarchal societies, this plays directly into the hands of anti-feminist voices, making it harder to achieve progress on truly urgent gender issues. The impact is then that it becomes much harder to build public support and critical mass for real change. Feminism has always dependent on public momentum through protest, education, and political advocacy. But when a movement is seen as extreme or trivial, people are less likely to join, donate, or even listen. Therefore, not only does the feminist movement fail to create change, they actually facilitate regression of the movement because women reject their message. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.
Panel for generations, the feminist movement has pushed for progress by challenging the beliefs, systems, and cultural norms that stand in the way of true gender equality. As society continues to evolve, it's time for feminism to take a bold and unapologetic stance against popular fairy tales that continue to reinforce traditional and limiting gender roles. These stories may seem harmless, but they quietly shape how young minds view gender, identity, and power. Sure, not all fairy tales are negative. However, it is very crucial to recognize that when cultural products consistently depict women as passive, voiceless, and primarily valued for their beauty, feminist voices must respond. This pushback has proven effective. Today, we can see a media landscape that includes empowered characters like Moana and Raya. These changes are not coincidental, they are the result of opposition, critique, and a demand for better representation. Moving on to my rebuttals, there Their rebuttal to our second argument was about how feminist movement actually criticizing this will be seen as bad. The first thing I want to note here is that we reject the metric as something that is perceived as antagonistic ought to be wrong, especially when advocacy groups in general are seen already as radical because of how they ought to change the status quo. Opposition tries to do more than just claim that something perceived as bad is always unjust, especially when norms themselves have been structurally oppressive for minorities for centuries. Also, they talked about how this is a waste of time for a feminist movement, and the feminist movement does not have to actively oppose it, they can be just silent about it. Firstly, these claims completely dismiss the core burden of this debate, whether the feminist movement as a movement with public voice, cultural responsibility, and ideological clarity should take a stand on how cultural products that still shape gender is understood. Saying just be silent is not a stance, it's an invasion. If the movement remains neutral, how exactly is it doing about narratives that continue to teach children, especially young girls, that they are meant to wait, be chosen, and aspire to marriage over agency? The idea that this is a waste of this debate isn't happening in a vacuum. It assumes a cultural tipping point where feminist messaging is gaining visibility and where science or neutrality should be interpreted as tacit approval. If these tales remain part of school books, children's sections, and public media, the feminist movement says nothing. It sends a message that these portrayals are acceptable. Cultural engagement is one of also, they said that this will lead to the backlash of the feminist movement for being antagonistic, and more conservative women and societies will dislike the feminist movement. As I said before, every major social justice movement has been called too antagonistic at some point. Civil rights, LGBTQ rights, and reproductive rights each face backlash when they challenge dominant cultural narratives. The feminist movement cannot shoot progress while also fearing temporary pushback. Backlash is not only inevitable, it's often a signal that the status quo is being disrupted. Moving on to the last argument of our team, the industry is already shifting, opposing accelerates progress, not backlash. Challenging outdated gender portrayals may cause short-term chaos, but it ultimately fosters innovation. Feminist critique has historically categorized and improved storytelling rather than cultural decay. Judge media giants like Disney and Netflix don't operate in a vacuum. They're highly responsive to cultural trends. When criticized for their shallow representation of female characters, they have introduced characters like Elsa, Moana, and Mirabelle, girls who possess agency, complexity, and depth. These films receive widespread acclaim. White audiences, especially younger viewers, create narratives that reflect a reality where women are gaining more rights, breaking down barriers, and redefining outdated norms. Moreover, because these stories explore richer emotional arcs and more relevant conflicts, they also elevate the artistic quality of storytelling. The feminist movement, acting as a moral and cultural compass, gives these companies further incentives to shift away from lazy tropes and create content that resonates with today's audiences. What is the impact of this argument? A. Feminist opposition gives producers the moral license and market pressure to invest in more inclusive storytelling, and when those stories succeed, they raise the bar not just for gender, but for emotional and narrative quality overall. They're less about saving the princess and more about saving yourself. And B. You get content that's richer, more meaningful, and better aligned with modern values. The feminist movement doesn't lose credibility by opposing these tales. It gains relevance because it shows that feminism is not just about legal reform or abstract ideology, it's about changing the very stories that shape who we become. So in conclusion, the feminist movement should not be afraid to speak out, especially when the cultural landscape still normalizes outdated ideals. The world is changing, our story should be too, and it starts with drawing a clear line on what we want the next generation to inherit. And that is why we're so happy to propose. Thank you.
In the status quo, fairy tales are a very important part of in a child's life, and this is why the feminist movement should not be opposing. Furthermore, in the status quo, there are already a lot of new stories that already support feminism, and this is why we think that it's unnecessary to go a step further and just oppose feminism. Old stories. So moving on to our quick responses before our argument. So they talked about how in their third argument, how industries are already changing their policies and making new more like feminism, like equal rights, like movies about like Elsa or Moana. However, this is not really relevant because first of all, this is about new tales, not challenging the old ones. And even if this is true, with Disney changing its policy, we can have more perspectives on women, and we are able to call up their benefits because we also have it, but we are better because we have more views, making children and people more open to this new feminist movement. They also talked about how there's not gonna be how there's not gonna be backlash because like because like because they talked about how there's they need backlash and they it's gonna happen and it's inevitable, but that's why they need to recover. However, like the female oppressed societies feeling that they're being called out as bad, and then the males who are being who are in the oppressive society are going to be are going to bar them from actually solving the problem, supporting feminism. And moving on to our third argument, which is about how argument three, it detracts focus on creating more diverse narratives necessary for female empowerment. Opposing means publicly criticizing, boycotting, or demanding reforms from the companies that produce traditional fairy tales. However, when traditional fairy tales are owned by powerful media corporations, especially giants like Disney, it is unrealistic to expect legal threats, public discrediting, or strategic suppression will make these companies completely abandon traditional stories, especially when, no thank you, they make a lot of money from them. This is to say that Gov has no solvency, so simply opposing these stories will not bring about the changes that Gov naively sells. Instead of spending its limited resources fighting entrenched cultural products, the feminist movement should redirect its attention, no thank you, collaborating with media producers to create more diverse, inclusive, and empowering stories. This would include fairy tales with women of color, LGBTQ characters, disabled heroines, or characters from different cultural backgrounds, all of which are severely underrepresented in current media. This constructive path does far more to reshape cultural norms than simply attacking old ones. The impact, therefore, is that the government's approach wastes valuable time and energy on a symbolic battle that yields little change. But even worse, they lose the opportunity to channel their resources in expanding the space for alternative, empowering narratives that can resonate with a more diverse audience. For this reason, is proud to oppose.
Let's begin by identifying what this debate is actually truly about. At its core, it's about whether the feminist movement on ideological, cultural, and social force should take a public and symbolic stance against fairy tales that portray women as docile, silent, and waiting to be rescued. Opposition would like to minimize this debate to questions of individual enjoyment or media preference. We'll prove instead that this is about what values feminism should fight for and how resisting outdated stories creates the very cultural shift we're trying to achieve. Moving on to my first question, what is the role of the feminist movement and who empowers women more? Opposition wants you to believe that feminism should remain silent, neutral, or vague. That maybe these tales aren't ideal, but they are not harmful enough to warrant action. But here's what that really means. The very movement meant to oppose systems of inequality becomes complicit in upholding them simply because they're wrapped in nostalgia and pretty dresses. Let's break this down. They say these are just stories or people enjoy them for fun, but fictional stories doesn't mean harmless. Stories shape worldviews, especially for children. Fairy tales are often a child's first exposure to what it means to be a girl. When those girls are beautiful, silent, and rewarded for waiting, that lesson becomes normalized. We don't need 5-year-olds to read feminist manifestos. We need to stop reinforcing that love and beauty are their own destiny. Even if they say that people can interpret stories however they want, they should prove how this is going to happen. We say that it is unlikely for most because interpretation requires, more importantly, their own argument flips to our side. If stories can be interpreted in many ways, then the feminist movement provides a strong counter-narrative that only enriches the conversation. It makes reinterpretation public, thoughtful, and widespread, not silent and private. Finally, they claim that this alienates conservative women. We ask, since when is feminism about pleasing the patriarchy? Backlash is not failure. Every movement that has demanded social change, civil rights, LGBTQ plus rights, women's suffrage was told they were too loud, too radical, too divisive. Being feared by traditionalists is not weakness of feminism. It's a sign that it's working. And even if opposition exaggerates the backlash, we live in a world of pluralistic ideas with more independent women than ever before. When public campaigns fail to account for social context and emotional nuance, they don't dismantle oppression. They just provoke cultural backlash, and that weakens the credibility of the next fight, even when it's about urgent structural injustice. Moving on to my second clash about cultural engagement. Does opposition actually improve the world or actually preserve the problem? Opposition has painted our side as wasting time as if opposing fairy tales is a distraction, but that fundamentally misunderstands how social movements actually function. Feminism is not a single issue project. It works in law, in education, in healthcare, and yes, in culture. Because culture shapes the subconscious beliefs that legal rights alone cannot do. Cannot undo. We're not asking feminism to throw all its funding into fairy tale protests. We're talking about symbolic public opposition public opposition statements, counter stories, reframing. These are low resource, high impact tools. Culture is one of the cheapest and most effective areas to fight gender inequality. The claim that this is a misuse of time is not only false, it's the dismissive of the actual burden of the debate. Let's turn now to the biggest false narrative from opposition, that our side would destroy joy or creativity. In fact, the opposite is true. Opposing outdated tales has always sparked better storytelling. We now have characters like Moana, Rhea, and Elsa, not despite feminist critic, but because of it. These stories have depth, agency, and complexity. They're more artistically rich, more relatable. Let's be real, more commercially successful. The feminist movement helped create the conditions for that progress. By rejecting lazy tropes, we gave creators the push and permission to imagine something better. Therefore, even if you believe in the vague harm from opposition that it will lead to backlash, we'll take it because this is precisely what drives reform. It's an uncomfortable conversation that producers respond to when choosing which scripts to greenlight and which stories to elevate. Every bit of cultural tension forces a creator to reconsider the power of their narratives. At the end of this debate, one side wants the feminist movement to step back, be quiet, and let the same stories dominate by default. The other side, our side, wants a movement that is courageous, consistent, and clear. We don't need a destroy fairy tales, but we do need to stop pretending they're harmless just because they're old. Thank you.
Government stance is overly utopian in that they believe that women from marginalized communities are suddenly going to be empowered and actually make reforms against sexism by just opposing fairy tales with traditional gender norms. In reality, this is not true, and it only makes women from these societies farther from feminist movements, right? Two questions I found in today's debate. First of all, which side empowers the minority, women from a marginalized communities? Second, will backlash happen with opposing fairy tales with traditional gender norms? And what does this lead to? First clash point. And I'd like to explain my structure. There's going to be rebuttals inside my clash points. Which side empowers the minority women from a marginalized community? And talking about the first argument that we talked about, the government actually didn't rebut it, and towards the third argument that they had said rebutting it, industries are already changing. This is not true because it's not relevant because this is about new tales, not challenging old ones because the new ones is more adventurous, not talking about more gender norms, right? No, thank you. And also, staying neutral is not okay, mister. And third of all, a backlash happens like the females in oppressive societies feeling that they are being called out as bad, right? And the males who are in oppressive society are going to bar them from actually, right? And moving on. Why are the first clash point? Why are they even important, right? These women who live in marginalized community are under oppression, and they are forced by tradition and societal norms to act this way. Women that have to live by gender norms are neglected or labeled as bad, discouraged, and they're discouraged from even supporting the men in these society where women are oppressed may distort the feminists out of touch and bad, right? If the feminist women oppose these fairy tales, this seems like the feminists in developed areas abandoned them and does not care about them. These minority women, no thank you. These minority women enjoy watching these movies because they can actually relate, and they feel like they're being demonized in the eyes of the feminists when they oppress it, right? And they cannot empower these women on their side because they demonize, as I told you, and oppose the very fairy tales that they are able to create. No, thank you. Even if there are movies like Frozen or Brave that promote individuality and break the gender norm, this is symmetric on our side because our side we are able to empower the women because they can actually relate, because what these people actually see in these Disney movies are not actually about this gender that these Disney movies actually portray gender roles, but rather it's just an important source of entertainment, right? And also they're watching and also be able to protect the gender norm, that this is symmetric on our side, as I told you, and and also be able to protect really vulnerable women who are labeled as bad in their world because they represent the very life that the feminists go against. Second clash point: will backlash happen with opposing fairy tales with traditional gender norms, and what does this lead to? The first question: yes, it does create backlash, and it blocks children's important source of entertainment on other and these women, and a way to make people more open to conditions that women live in, right? It raises awareness and oppressive standards for women on our side. In their side, it makes women think like they are bad in developing or oppressive countries, and it creates backlash in the society. And also, if they want to talk about children, these children actually look into these movies as just entertainment and just a normal story where a prince comes to the princess's house. However, pointing out the fact that Disney actually portrays gender roles will actually make even bigger troubles, since these children never knew about that. Because so at the end of the day, what these feminist movements are actually doing is telling an innocent child's mind that a woman should stay at home, and the prince is always going to come to their house. I've never been so proud of that.
At the end of the day, government loses this debate because they fail to prove why their side has solvency in making reform society with oppressive traditions. We win this debate because we, on the other hand, have shown you that our side makes people more open to other types of women who are living in oppressive societies, and how we have symmetric alternative Disney fairy tales in the status quo, more than protocols. The first issue of our side was which side empowers the minority, women from a marginalized community. Government told us that the culture is going to change, but this is only going to make oppressive societies more and more away from these feminists. However, we told you that these women on their side is not going to get empowered or even support the feminist movement, because the feminists are going to be opposing the very fairy tales that they're capable of relating to, and they think that, oh, these feminists are demonizing me and they don't like me and they portray me as bad. Why should I even relate to them and even actually support them? Even if there are movies like Frozen and Brave that promote individuality and break the gender norm and they like this is symmetric on our side. Our side is able to empower the woman because they can actually relate to what they're watching. Also be able to protect the really vulnerable women who are labeled as bad in their world, because they represent the very life that the feminists go against. Women that have to live by the gender norms are neglected or labeled as bad on their side, and their side does nothing to actually help this, because their side just labels them, oh, this feminist movement is bad, instead of just raising awareness. That's why we take the second, but that's why we take the first issue. The second issue was, will backlash happen with opposing fairy tales with traditional gender norms, and what will this lead to? Government told us that there will be no backlash, but this only leads to more backlash on their side when opposing the fairy tales. Their side makes women think that they're bad in developing or oppressing countries, and this creates backlash in society. It blocks children from an important source of entertainment and a way to make these children more open to conditions that women live in and actually be more aware of it. However, we told you that it raises awareness and oppressive standard for women on our side, and make more people open to these women without thinking that they were weak, to not go against this gender norm and actually understand that there are traditional gender norms that are still relevant to this day. And this is why we take the second clash. So in conclusion, opposition clearly this debate because we proved how we are able to win on both terms, on how we empower the minority and actually lead to less backlash and actually have better awareness and actually have more viable change. Thank you very much.
So opposition seems to care about the fundamental damage of companies like Disney's. True, we do agree that this kind of damage might occur, as they say, but we stated that these stories hurt something way far deeper, the minds and expectations of an entire generation. At the end of this debate, the most important and the most key clash is what shapes the values of a generation more, a policy document or a story they grow up with. Then what's our stance? It was very, very clear, Judge. We told you that stories like Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty don't just reflect gender inequality, but they teach it, normalize it, and pass it down. If feminism does not challenge the culture that creates sexism, this is just touching the outer part, but not the inner part, which is actually the most important thing in today's debate about these famous stories and about these tales that talk about things like that create stereotypes and talk about things like women should wear dresses and marry boys, etc. Then what was opposition stance? They stated that this will cause a lot of economic damage to famous companies like Disney, and they also stated that this can bring backlash of children. Our case obviously takes this debate home, since we proved, you judge, that a story read at the age of 4 or 5 will strongly impact the individual, affecting the feminist movement at the end way more than way more than cite opposition. They stated that this will bring backlash, but we still think that letting these innocent minds judge, they're just kids. They're just vulnerable kids. Do you really think that they'll just understand what they say? They'll just understand what the story is actually trying to tell us about these stereotypes and about these biases that will end up occurring. Thus, we believe that the feminist movement should foster in removing and banning these more than pro to oppose. Thank you.